Hi, it's Matt Douglas with Accruit. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about a rule that we refer to as the substantially the same as identified rule in the context of 1031 exchange. Many of you who've done 1031 exchanges or are considering doing one or looking at resources online are familiar with the requirement of identifying the replacement property or properties that you're interested in actually acquiring as part of the exchange. That's typically done by identifying the property address, legal description, or something similar. It's generally what it comes down to within the first 45 days after the sale of the old property or the relinquished property. Sometimes, in particular in the context of the acquisition of a tenant-in-common arrangement or a Delaware Statutory Trust interest, or any sort of interest in real estate that is fractional or less than 100% of the interest in the replacement property, sometimes it's unknown the exact amount of the replacement property that's ultimately going to be acquired as part of the exchange, okay? Enter what we refer to as the substantially the same as identified rule, which is actually something that comes out of the 1031 regulations. And what it provides is that the property that is ultimately acquired in a 1031 exchange must be substantially the same, it's the language that's used, as the property that was identified within the first 45 days of the exchange. Now, if someone identifies a property address because their intent is to acquire the entire property and they ultimately do acquire the entire property, great, the rule is satisfied. It's exactly the same in that scenario. But the example in the regulations where this rule comes from refers to a margin of error of 25%. So what that means is if I identify 123 Main Street in the first 45 days of my exchange, but I ultimately end up acquiring somewhat less than 100% of 123 Main Street, but more than 75%, then I'm within that 25% margin of error. And the general consensus is that's in compliance with that rule. So I can acquire an 80% interest in 123 Main Street, a 75% interest in 123 Main Street, and I'm okay. Another kind of more common area that this comes up is in the context of acquiring Delaware Statutory Trust or DST interests. Someone's already generally identifying a fractional interest in a DST. They might identify a 3% interest in DST XYZ. But it turns out that they're going to acquire something different than 3%. They're still limited by that 25% margin of error, but it's 25% of 3% in that scenario. So exchangers are somewhat limited. There's a window of flexibility, and they don't necessarily need to acquire exactly the property that was identified, but they've also got to stay within the 25% margin of error in order to ensure compliance with that rule. The flip side of this is what if they acquire somewhat more property than they identified within the first 45 days of the exchange? That is a little bit more controversial. You'll get different opinions from exchange commentators on whether someone can acquire more property than is identified at all. But to the extent that someone can acquire more property than was identified, they're certainly still limited by that 25% margin of error. There's more nuance involved in this rule, but that's the gist of it, and it's certainly something to be aware of when you're making an identification up front and understanding that you've got to acquire something very close to that identified property.